Okay, so in this video I'm going to be talking about the Holocaust from 1933 through to 1945. 1933, obviously the year that Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, through to 1945 and the end of the Second World War, which coincides with the end of the Holocaust. It's going to be an overview, and hopefully it'll be useful for Year 9, because obviously we're looking at the Holocaust now in lessons, and it'll be on your end of year exam. And obviously for Year 10 and 11, Jewish persecution in Nazi Germany is part of the course, so hopefully it'll be useful for you as well. I hope you do find it useful. So the Holocaust, well, before Hitler became leader of Germany, there were 8 million Jews living in Europe, all around Europe, 8 million Jews. Now, as we know, in the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis between 1939 and 1945 during the war. But there were many different groups killed during the Holocaust. It wasn't just the Jews, remember. There were Soviet prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war. They were killed in quite large numbers. Poles, people from Poland, Roma, or gypsies as you might call them, but Roma is the proper term. Roma, R-O-M-A. Disabled people, both physically and mentally. Jehovah's Witnesses, they were a religious group. You've probably heard of Jehovah's Witnesses, a religious group who en masse refused to accept Nazi rule in Germany. So they were killed, and homosexuals as well. So not just the Jews. That's one important thing to remember. The Holocaust isn't just the murder of Jews, it's the murder of several groups of people. The Jews being the main group, but obviously those other groups are involved as well. Now, we don't know for sure, or in accurate terms, how many people died in the Holocaust in total. We know that it was well over 10 million in total, obviously 6 million Jews, but we know it was well over 10 million. Two researchers called Martin Dean and Jeffrey Megargy, they estimate between about 15 to 20 million. I mean, obviously there aren't that many accurate records kept of the Holocaust, so we just do not know how many people died. But as I say, estimates now are looking at between 15 and 20 million. Huge numbers of people, 15 to 20 million. So you can get an idea of the scale of the murder in the Holocaust. Remember that when Hitler comes to power in Germany in January 1933, although he brings with him his anti-Semitism, to remind Year 9 in particular, that is hatred of Jewish people. So Hitler is anti-Semitic and doesn't really try to hide this. When he becomes leader of Germany, he's very open and vocal about his anti-Semitism. But remember, we looked at this Year 9 the other day, he was not, by no means, the first leader of a country or of a group to attack the Jews in Europe. By no means. We looked at anti-Semitism in Europe and persecution of Jews, and it's been going on in Europe for about 2,000 years nearly. So Hitler doesn't invent anti-Semitism, far from it. He's very open and vocal with his anti-Semitism, but he does not invent this. It's a feeling that's been prevalent and existed in Europe for a great deal of time, for a long time. Some examples actually of that are Jewish communities being attacked in medieval Europe. Remember, Year 9, we looked at Saint Gregory, who had labelled the Jews as murderers of Christ in the year 390. He'd said that Jews were murderers of Christ. We talked about that in detail. The Crusaders, the Christian Crusaders who go around Europe in the 11th century, they killed many Jews. In quite large numbers. All of the Jews had been expelled from England in 1290. They'd been expelled by King Edward I. There are so many more examples. You've got many written down in your book of persecution of Jews before 1933. So again, Hitler doesn't invent this. He brings with him these ideas, but he's not the first person to say, Jews are this, Jews are that, Jews are horrible. From the moment he becomes leader, though, he persecutes the Jews. Almost from the moment he becomes leader. Remember that Hitler had blamed the Jews for all of the problems in Germany post-World War I. He said that they were responsible for the mass unemployment in Germany. Year 10 and 11, you should know a great deal about this. Mass unemployment in Germany, Hitler says it's the Jews' fault. all of the problems in Germany associated with the Treaty of Versailles. He also says that's the Jews' fault. Remember that some of the people who had signed the Treaty of Versailles for Germany were Jewish. Not all of them, but some of them were. So again, Hitler finds it quite easy to go, it's the Jews' fault, because, you know, the Jews signed the Treaty of Versailles. Well, some Jews signed it, but some non-Jews signed it. But, you know, Hitler uses that. Jews were labelled by Hitler and by the Nazis as Untermenschen. I've mentioned this in Year 10 lessons and Year 11 lessons. Untermenschen basically means subhuman, kind of below human. Okay, so there's humans and then there's everyone underneath, Untermenschen, including the Jews. That's what Hitler and the Nazis say. When Hitler became leader of Germany, there were about 500,000 Jews living in Germany. So 500,000 Jews immediately labelled as Untermenschen. Now, initially, persecution involved things like boycotting Jewish businesses, so not using Jewish businesses or Jewish shops, the sacking of Jewish lawyers and teachers and civil servants, so people in those jobs being sacked, and I've talked about this in quite a lot of detail, race studies being taught in schools, so children learning in Nazi Germany that some races of people were better or worse than others, and the Jews were, you know, it was said that the Jews were at the bottom of this scale, if you like, of races. You know, they were right at the bottom. Again, Untermenschen. Now, in September 1935, Hitler and the Nazis introduced the Nuremberg laws. Now, the Nuremberg laws banned marriages and, well, relationships between Jewish people and non-Jews. Okay, so you couldn't, if you were Jewish, you couldn't marry a non-Jew, or vice versa. It also removes all of their civil rights. It takes away their citizenship of Germany, their citizenship from Germany, so they're no longer considered German citizens. So they couldn't vote, things like that. Now, this doesn't actually get enforced until after the 1936 Summer Olympics, because Hitler and the Nazis were worried that they didn't want to come across in a negative light to the rest of the world. Obviously, the world kind of descends on Germany for the Olympics, and Hitler doesn't enforce these Nuremberg laws until after this, because again, he's worried that he doesn't want Germany to look bad at this point. Many Jews during this period, before the war, before World War II, tried to emigrate, tried to leave Germany. I talked about this with Year 9 the other day. But it wasn't easy, because we had to do two things. First, you had to get a visa, which is basically permission to move to another country. And also, if you did leave Germany, so if you did manage to get a visa for Britain or America or wherever, if you did manage to get one of those, in order to leave Germany, the Jews who left had to give 90% of their wealth to the government in the form of a tax before they left. So imagine 90% of all the wealth and the value of things that you own, you've got to give that up before you're allowed to leave Germany. So they make it incredibly hard for the Jews to leave, because one, it's already hard enough to get a visa to go to another country, and two, when you do leave, obviously you have to give up most of what you own. So, you know, it's hard for the Jewish people to leave Germany. Now, from 1938, the persecution became even more severe. I've written a list here so I don't forget anything. There's a huge list of anti-Jewish laws and persecution that comes in, and this doesn't even cover all of it. But the main things from 1938 onwards: Jews could not be doctors. Jews had to add the name Israel if they were a man, or Sarah if they were a woman. They had to add that name to their name to mark out that they were Jewish. Jewish children could not go to school. They weren't allowed to own gardens. Jewish people were not allowed to own gardens or private gardens. They weren't allowed in cinemas or theatres. And of course, Year 10 and 11, you'll know about this Kristallnacht on the night of the 9th of November 1938. Kristallnacht, as you know, was an orchestrated attack on Jewish homes, businesses and synagogues. Okay, so Jewish shops and homes and businesses and synagogues are attacked, you know, windows are smashed in, and particularly synagogues are burned to the ground. In 1939, obviously in September, as we know, particularly Year 10 and 11, you know about this, the Nazis invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and World War II begins. Okay, from that point, on the 3rd of September, Britain and France declare war on Germany because they'd warned them not to invade Poland, and they did. So World War II starts. After World War II, particularly once the Germans had invaded Poland, ghettos were introduced in countries like Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe that the Nazis had invaded. Now, ghettos, I'll just hold it up again in case you're wondering the spelling. Ghettos were areas of a city that were shut off from the rest of the city. Okay, so all of the Jews in that city were moved to the ghetto to live. Okay, very famously, year 9, we've looked at the Warsaw Ghetto when we looked at the pianist. Jews in Warsaw and from the surrounding areas in Poland are moved to the Warsaw Ghetto. Remember, there are nearly 400,000 Jews in Warsaw, and they moved to an area that is just not big enough. Okay, the ghettos were cramped, really overcrowded. The food was limited. Remember, they're limited to about 300 calories a day, when, as we know, you need closer to 3,000. Any Jews who tried to escape from these ghettos were executed. And it was very unsanitary. They were horrible places to live. They were moved there and forced to live there. And Jews in the ghetto were also used for slave labour. So the Jews who were working there were forced to do certain jobs by the Nazis. Those who couldn't work were basically left to die from hunger or disease, because obviously with the sanitation and the cleanliness being so poor, many of them died from disease. So by 1942, the ghettos were beginning to be liquidated, which basically means emptied, and the Jews were being moved to extermination camps or concentration camps around Nazi-occupied Europe. Remember, there is a difference. A concentration camp is a camp where you are sent to essentially be worked to death, really. Many people died in concentration camps because they were literally worked to death. They were worked and worked and worked by the Nazis, not obviously looked after or cared for properly, and they died. Extermination camps or death camps, well, the clue is in the name, really. That is where you are sent to be killed. Okay, so from about 1942 onwards, the ghettos are being liquidated or emptied, and the Jews are being moved to one of those kind of camps. As well as ghettoisation, or being moved into the ghettos, the Nazis also used EINSATZGRUPPEN. Okay, they are Nazi death squads. I've talked about this with both Year 9 and 10 in recent lessons. Death squads who would move around Eastern Europe and would go into towns and villages in Eastern Europe, would round up the Jews that they could find and any other undesirables, to use a Nazi phrase, basically, to round up any people who they didn't like, including the Jews, and would execute them, most often through mass shootings. Quite often the victims of these mass executions or mass shootings would have to dig their own grave, a large hole in the ground, and would be shot one by one into these graves. Pretty horrific. Now, towards the end of the Holocaust, from 1942 onwards, the Nazis come up with the final solution. Okay, we talked about this Year 10 a few weeks ago. The final solution. Remember, this is decided at the Wannsee conference. That should be written in your books, or certainly in the textbook. So look it up if you haven't got it in your exercise book. The Wannsee conference. Now, Wannsee is a region just outside of Berlin. It's actually physically quite beautiful. There's a really nice lake there, and even the house where the conference took place is very nice. But as we know, the final solution is one of the most horrific things to happen in history. The Wannsee conference is where it is decided and agreed on the 20th of January, I should say, 1942, that the Jewish population who are under the control of the Nazis should be executed, should be destroyed, exterminated. So the agreement, on the extermination of all Jews, because it was decided really that the ghettos and the EINSATZGRUPPEN were too inefficient. Okay, they were too slow. So obviously in the ghettos, people are worked to death or left to die, which takes a period of time. And in terms of the EINSATZGRUPPEN, it was considered by the Germans a bit of a waste of soldiers. You know, it was the SS who were used, who could be used for other things, fighting in the war for one. It was seen as kind of a waste of resources and expensive. You know, every bullet that is, again, to use the Nazi way of thinking. Every bullet that you use on a Jew is wasted, really, when it could be used in the war against the British or the Americans or the Russians. So 6 specialised death camps where, as I say, people were literally sent to die, sent to be killed, were built with gas chambers capable of killing 2,000 people at once. And obviously crematoriums attached or in the camps to get rid of the bodies, to burn the bodies. Jews were transported to these camps, usually in cattle trucks. We looked at this Year 9 the other day. They were transported in cattle trucks where they were crammed in, awful conditions. When they got to the camps, they were separated into 2 lines. One line for those who would be used for work, so that was mostly young men, men who could be used for physical labour, and another line for people who would be marked for death, particularly babies and young children, pregnant women, the elderly and the sick. They were the typical groups who were marked for death, who would be killed there and then, really, or certainly very quickly. By mid-1944, however, Germany were losing the war. Again, we've looked at this, Year 9 in particular, we've looked at this. And in the east, the Soviet army were advancing towards Germany, or certainly towards Poland, where these death camps were, or most of these death camps were. And so at that point, the camps in the east were closed down, and the remaining inmates were shipped to camps closer to or inside Germany. Now, the Nazis tried to hide what they'd done. So the gas chambers were dismantled, the crematoriums were dynamited, were blown up. The Nazis did their very best to cover their crimes. Many of the mass graves were actually dug up, and the rest of the bodies that had been put in the mass graves were cremated. And the remaining inmates, as I say, were moved closer to Germany or into Germany, into camps there. And they were taken on, many of them, death marches, where they were literally marched to the other camp. Okay, they weren't put on a train, they weren't put in lorries, they were marched from the camp that they were in to the one that they were moving to. And over 250,000 Jews died on these death marches because they were, again, walked to death, essentially. Now, eventually the camps, both the death camps and the concentration camps, were discovered, and they were liberated from the east by the advancing Soviets, and from the west and from kind of the south of Germany, liberated most commonly by the Americans or by the British. And after the war, the surviving Nazis, who, as I say, survived the war, so not people like Hitler or Goebbels, but the surviving Nazis, the high-ranking Nazis who had survived the war, were put on trial at the Nuremberg trials, and 11 of the defendants were those who were found guilty. 11 of the defendants were found guilty and executed. Many more were found guilty and they were sent to prison. But 11 of the men who were found guilty at the Nuremberg trials were executed. So that's an overview of the Holocaust. Hopefully it's been really useful for years 9, 10 and 11. Again, there's plenty more on Jewish persecution and the Holocaust in your textbooks, so make sure you're looking in there for revision for the exams coming up. But like I say, I hope that's been useful, and I will see you very soon.